We all know the two hardest problems in computer science are cache invalidation and naming things. Right? But that's computer science. Today I'm thinking more like an engineer, trying to build stuff and ship it. And I think maybe the two hardest problems in software engineering are knowing what to build and changing what we've currently got in order to get it built. It's that kind of systems design, systems change stuff that no one really teaches you, but you have to learn it. If you want to build anything that actually matters to people, you have to learn how to change existing systems, how to integrate new systems with old systems, and fundamentally, how to figure out what changes are worth making and what changes are possible. Because if you don't, you're just going to either end up busily building things that don't matter or don't ship, or you get into a world of frustration because your brilliant ideas never quite make it to production because you can't get other people to line up with you. The systems thinking you need is very important to learn, and it's very difficult to learn. But I think I can offer some hope. I really do, because I've long had this suspicion that the skills that make us good designers of software, understanding constraints, understanding resource management and allocation and communication protocols and feedback loops, all those software skills might make us well placed to become great designers of systems in the larger sense. Understanding the interlocking systems of software and people, and needs and supplies and provisioning, of understanding CPU limits and budgetary limits. I've got an inkling that we might get good at it, but it's just an inkling. And I'm going to need an expert to help us think from where we are with software to wider systems. And my expert this week is the terrific Diana Montalion. She's the author of Learning Systems Thinking from O'Reilly. And she's a terrific repository of war stories and trench stories of software change and techniques for understanding the systems we're building and for finding opportunities for improvement. If you learn one thing from this conversation, it's going to be that the differences between software systems and systems in the larger sense are very thin indeed. Maybe that difference doesn't really exist. But there's far more than that one thing to learn this week, so we better get started. I'm your host, Chris Jenkins. This is Developer Voices, and today's voice is Diana Montalion. Diana, good to see you. How are you?
Good to see you too, Chris. Good, great. Thank you for having me. It's so good to see you again.
I'm glad you're here. The last time we met, we were in Copenhagen at a conference. And we spoke at that conference. We did an interview, but I just felt that 40 minutes wasn't enough. So we're going to stretch out and really give this topic a good going over.
I love that. Plus, we did so much talking before the interview that we then couldn't fit into the interview. That I'm glad now we can sort of bring it together.
Yeah, let's do this topic properly. Let's do it justice. So your topic is large, very abstract, but sometimes the most useful large things are. Let's start with what it is. So you've written a book called Learning Systems Thinking. I think about systems a lot, but give me a definition of systems thinking.
So a challenge with the phrase with systems thinking as a definition is that it's defined differently by different groups that are trying to define it. So, for example, in academia, it would be different than in the way we might mean it here, which would be different than the way you might go to a marketing course that bringing systems thinking in. And also, I don't just mean systems thinking. I also mean pattern thinking, and I mean all forms of nonlinear thinking and formal logic. So I think the best way to describe it is to consider how time and relationships produce effect. In other words, as opposed to when we think linearly, we're thinking about predictability, we're thinking about control, we're concerned with having control, we're practicing reductionism, where we take something complex and we break it into parts. That's what we do in object-oriented programming. And so what I focus on are the other tools in our toolbox. That those skills are really important for building software, but they're not the only ways of thinking, and they're not the only ways of understanding how to have impact in a system.
Yes. So I feel like as an industry over the past 20 odd years, we have struggled with this, and somehow we've latched upon the idea that the problem is waterfall thinking and the answer is agile thinking. And that's going to solve all our systems interrelational problems, so we get a Scrum board. And it doesn't seem to work. And I'm just... I'm hoping you can pull me out of that morass, because it feels like we're desperately searching around for tools to do a better job of the wider system.
Yeah, and we're in a situation where the relational complexity has increased exponentially. When I began my career, I usually worked in a monolith, and the relationship was between the software layer and the database layer. And that's a pretty linear relationship. Meanwhile, because I build digital information systems, the world around me became a ubiquitous knowledge graph. Like every piece of software that has browser access is usually also communicating with social media platforms or with APIs, or now it's, there's a front end decoupled from the back end. And so we're struggling with this because we're terrible at systems thinking. Humans are, and we don't know that we are, and we don't know what it looks like when we're bad at it. That we're learning now. But also, the world is changing around us. The way that we do infrastructure, now we do infrastructure as code, and it's like all these pieces in relationship. So we're struggling, but not just because we're struggling. We're struggling because we are actually faced with a whole bunch of change and figuring out what to do in this brave new world of information.
Yeah, we definitely... we always used to build systems as small and contained as possible and slip up terribly when it came to integration time. And now it seems like integration is so much a part of every large system.
Yeah, and in a way, I feel like we were able to maintain the delusion that everything isn't interrelated and that we actually could control how a system behaves. And we can't really anymore. I was on a panel recently, and it was talking about complexity, and the overwhelming sense was that complexity is bad and we should attack it, and we should make things simple. And I'm actually relatively comfortable in complexity. Things are complex. Complexity just is. So I don't think we have this very like command and control approach to increasing complexity. And I think that even we need to sort of figure out the difference between complexity and complication. Complexity is just the nature of all of the world. Like that's just how things are complex. Relationships are complex. Challenges are complex. People are complex, like these are complex.
That's true.
But complication is, and the kind of complexity I think they're referring to is what happens when we add a bunch of noise and can't find the signal, right? That, in other words, we're trying to solve these problems, these new challenges. We're trying to solve them. We don't know how to solve them. So we do a whole bunch of things that often just make it worse. And then we call that complexity. And
Mm-hmm. I've definitely been involved in systems and workplaces where you know something's fundamentally broken, but you have no idea how to fix it. And so you end up just trying to focus on the things you can change.
Yeah. So in systems, there are two things that are pretty much always true, which we know from, decades of system science. One is that when we don't know what to do, when we're in a situation where our attempt to control doesn't work the way we want it to, we blame. That's the first thing. We blame. Our mind justifies what's happening. And we blame the wrong thing. It would be great if we blamed the right thing. We blame the other team or leadership, or we blame the wrong thing. And then there's what's called counterintuitiveness, which is that we kind of know where the problem is. We don't really know what to do about it. And we do the wrong thing. We do the things that make it worse, which makes sense because the way that we built the current system is why we're having the problem in the first place, right? The system is changing. We designed it. Now we need to redesign it, but we're redesigning it with basically the same type of thinking that caused our challenges in the first place. So we tend to just be making it worse. And this is totally fine. It's really normal. There's not really a way of getting around it. What I find helps is if we recognize when we don't know what to do because it's a complex challenge or a new challenge, a novel challenge to us, that we're likely, our first attempts at solving the problem are likely going to blame the wrong thing and do things that make it worse. And therefore, if we can recognize that that's going to happen, we can learn and grow and see what happens and then come to better conclusions. But we like to be like, here's the problem, here's the solution, done.
Yeah. And if we're in management, there's a particular huge pressure to be that person.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. There's a very big difference between systems leadership and management. Those are not the same roles.
Okay, explain to me.
Well, you had mentioned, I love your questions. I just kind of sit and basking in the questions. Like these are exactly the right questions. So for me, early in my career, I worked on pretty high performing, healthy, agile teams. Now, everyone hates agile. Apparently, it's responsible for climate change. And part of the reason is that there are two things. We didn't evolve it. Like it was born in a moment to solve some problems, but then things change. So it's any approach that we develop will need to continuously be iteratively improved. That's actually the design of it, right? So we didn't really iterate it and develop things that help us more, but also we kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater. That a lot of the things that I learned early on was about reality refuses to bow down to power.
Reality refuses to bow down to power. Yes. Now, I've got a particular question I want to ask you about that, but I have to first play devil's advocate and say it wasn't designed to evolve. Someone is going to say, well, that's what retrospectives are in Agile.
Right. And it can very much be if people are using them to learn and grow. If the industry was doing retrospectives, if we were figuring out together, so what works and what doesn't work. And I'm not advocating any one methodology. Like, I'm not saying waterfall bad, agile right. In fact, waterfall, someone just told me recently that waterfall was actually very rarely practiced the way we have come to think of it. In other words, there were more qualities of change in the way that it was practiced than maybe have come through the historical record to us. I don't know, because I don't have a lot of experience with it.
I certainly have very early experience of the actual thing that happened being retro explained as though it were waterfall.
Yeah. And that for me, the core of agility, and take agile with a capital A out of it, but just having agility, the core of that for me is learning teams, is that we're able to make theories and predictions about what we're going to do, how long it will take us, how much energy it's going to take, and then be able to learn from that and adapt as we learn from users, as we learn from the tech itself, and that we're more performant when we are sharing our expertise, developing more learning and developing knowledge as we go. So the antithesis 20 years ago for me was that somebody could come up with a plan and give it to an engineering team, and then that's what would happen. Like,
Yeah.
So this should take 6 months and you'll build these, and they make a Gantt chart and it does this. And my experience is that doesn't work in most cases. Sometimes it's small enough you can know. And so for me, the agility is not about Jira. Like, it's not about the tools we use. It's more about the culture of knowledge flow, the culture of learning, the ability to bring 5 people together with very different priorities and understandings, and enabling those 5 people to come up with the best possible action in these circumstances, and know why they're taking this action. What are the reasons that convinced them that this was a good direction to go in? And then they do, and see what happens and iterate from there.
So is that, I'm just trying to think of this from the perspective of a typical software manager who has that team of 5 or whatever people, has pressures from above to deliver features. What are the, and genuinely wants this whole thing to work as best they can, right? The whole wider system, and they want the promotion because but they also want the system to be built well. What kind of, you go into this a bit in your book, what kind of mental tools should they be developing? And is the first one you've hinted there some kind of audit trail of decision making? Is that what you're saying?
Well, kind of. I call it feature-driven engineering. This is what we did in the beginning, which was, we're given a feature and we break it down and we do it. And doing feature-driven engineering is the right thing in some cases. So, for example, when I was working in monolithic software for a web presence, for example, and we were adding a form or whatever, then to some extent, feature-driven engineering pretty much works. You really don't need to overcomplicate it. And so it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is, as complexity increases, and it definitely doesn't give us the space to think about the system as a whole. So, for example, how do the different, if you have multiple pieces of software in relationship with each other, are you also improving the quality of those relationships? Are you improving the patterns in the system, how information is structured and shared, for example? And so feature-driven engineering is not concerned with the system as a whole. So this is where when people say technical debt, sometimes they mean there's no systems architecture. There's feature-driven engineering. You're adding new features and adding new features, but you're never thinking about, are we improving the system's ability to have impact, to give a competitive advantage to the organization, all the things that we have systems do.
Is this what you're talking about with conceptual integrity? Because I've definitely been involved in systems where it is an aggregation of features. And I can think of at least one programming language which hasn't been designed. It's just an aggregation of features, right? All the stuff that's been thrown at it over time. And you long for some overall vision that informs the shape of the architecture?
Yeah, exactly. And understanding, so to your question about the manager, right? Fundamental to systems thinking is that a system is not the sum of its parts. It's the relationship and interaction between those parts. That's what forms a system, right? If you don't have multiple subsystems in relationship to each other, you maybe don't even have a system, right? You have one unit that's working on its own.
Yeah.
This is really tricky where the boundaries between the word system or not are, because we could argue this endlessly, and the answer is there's really not a right answer. But for the manager who's doing feature-driven engineering, the success of the team then depends on the strength of the relationships within the team. How well does this group of people self-organize to be able to do what they need to do? And so in a way, systems leadership, to my mind, is more about making yourself obsolete. Like, how am I encouraging this ecosystem of problems that we're solving? Are they being communicated well so that the team can really understand why it matters that they're doing what they're doing? What is the real impact that they're having? And can they improve their impact? The ability to make recommendations that are very trustworthy and well thought out, because that builds trust between the team and the organization, right? Are they able to articulate their ideas? Are they able to experiment? And then are they able to work together, to row together towards their destination? And that as that ability of that cohesiveness improves, so does the team performance, right? These tend to be the teams that are the most successful.
Do you know, so let me pin this to something in my own experience, because I was having a conversation. This is really reminding me of. I was having a conversation last week with. You can tell me what your answer to this would have been.
I love synchronicity. I love it.
So, I was speaking to someone who had done their level best as a CEO to arrange such a team. Right, he'd hired smart developers, given them an autonomy over how they work, how they prioritize. They worked closely together. He dabbled with remote or on site to try and get a cohesive team, and they all seemed very busy, but they weren't doing things that the company needed. Right. And he was wondering, has he been too free? Has he given them too? Should I put in systems that lock down what they're doing a bit? And I said to him, so you mentioned feedback loops in your book. I said to him, how often do your developers speak to the users? And the answer was nearly never. The users speak to their project manager, who speaks to their account manager, who speaks to the product manager, who speaks to Jira, who speaks to our developers. And I said, well, that's why your developers are working on the wrong thing, because they can only see the priorities in front of them. They can only see I can see the ugliness of my code, so I'm going to refactor it. But they can't. But there's no feedback loop to the user, not a real one. I just felt in that system, you can have the most autonomous, high-performing team, and if the only problems they can find are technical ones, they won't solve the business problems.
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean?
I absolutely. And that's so much is described by Conway's law, that an organization that designs systems will design a system that mirrors their communication structure, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And so if giving the team autonomy to have impact, but from what you were describing, it sounds like there are 6 layers in between an engineering team and their actual impact. And so it's a telephone game of coming down to them to say, this is what you'll do. Then that's, from my point of view, that's not autonomy. That's autonomy over their own work. But when we think about designing a system, or we think about abstraction, for example, right? We're talking about both the X and the Y axis. In other words, if I'm working on something, my goal from a systems point of view is to improve the system as a whole, meaning in every organization, there is a reason that they exist. And there is something about their software system, their technology system, their people system, because those are the same thing, the socio-technical system, that gives them competitive advantage. That is very hard to do. Would be hard to go out tomorrow and I decide I'm going to compete with the CEO's organization and I'm going to do better and put them out of business. Mm-hmm. Why would that be hard for me to do? And why? The reason it would be hard is the most valuable part of that CEO's system, right? Whatever it is that the system does that really has value, that would be very hard for someone else to just magically come tomorrow and build exactly the same thing.
Right.
So whatever that core domain is for that system, that's where most of the talent and the money and attention should go, because that's and understanding it also from the user's point of view, because it has value to people. It doesn't just have random value. It has competitive advantage to people. Mm-hmm. And that is a guiding principle for every line of code that we write, right? That's together, that is actually what we're doing. So for me, a first step in developing systems architecture, systems thinking in an organization is to keep the how connected to the why. And the why isn't because the product manager told me to build this button, then it should be red. That's not the why. The why is, how is that red button having a positive impact on the experience of this system as a whole? How is it improving its value?
Yes. And this So how would you look to adjust the system that I described to address that?
So the easiest way, and I say easy in a like it's easy,
everything
but
in life is hard.
Yeah. The easiest way. So I used to call it a top-down elaboration, a TDE for short. And that just meant that in however you're sharing knowledge, right? So basically, you're describing knowledge flow. That the CEO has a particular understanding of the system. The business analysts will have a particular understanding. The product people will have a particular understanding. To a great extent, this is the cartoon of the blind men and the elephant, or the
Oh, yeah.
blindfolded, right? Where one person's describing an ear, one person's describing a tail. It's an elephant, but they don't recognize the whole. And so, however, information and the knowledge, these points of view, however we're communicating them, often the communication is very dissociated. Like you have different types of documentation, you have meetings most people aren't in where strategy decisions get made and then that just rolls down, but no one knows why that strategy decision got made. Like no one really understands the thinking behind it, the reasons it's important.
Yeah.
And so for me, what I called the TDE was just, for every story that I'm picking up in order to develop, do I have a way to click through to a document, or there's a one-page description of why this matters, what exactly we're trying to do, and how we'll know if we succeeded, connected to and how we're going to implement it. So the CEO has, in your story, the CEO says, the team's not working on what's important to the business. How does the team know what's important to the business? When they pick up a story or a feature to develop, can they also read about, have like a one-page overview that shares why this has been prioritized? How is this connected to what the CEO says is most important to the business? And usually that doesn't exist. There's a frustration of, this side doesn't know what that side's thinking. So I'll ask, well, then how does the knowledge flow between the two parts? Well, it trickles down. Well, it doesn't.
Yeah.
It doesn't trickle down.
And I know the way they, the wide, broad, generic they, but they try to solve this by saying, okay, we'll have better written user stories. But I always think, like, what you should actually do is try and get the developer to speak to the customer occasionally. Because no matter how well written the user story is that says that button should be blue, it doesn't have the emotional impact of watching Dave accidentally click the green button for the millionth time and ruin his morning, right? If our developers had an emotional connection and a direct verbal connection to the users who are feeling the impact, that, I think, would change their priorities in a way that a user story can't.
Well, and also user stories are reductionism. They are one tiny part of the user experience. So they really can be really helpful and really matter. I also like jobs to be done as a framework for stories, similar but somewhat different depending on what I'm building. But these are trying to make that connection. But in fact, all the user stories together actually represent what the software is, what people are doing with the software. So that's one of the challenges, is that a single user story is actually just a part of the whole. And it doesn't actually tell us a lot about what users value and how they behave as they move across these different features. Like that part's often missing.
Yeah.
But to your point, I have two very quick stories that totally prove it.
Please.
One is it was lead on a team that we were doing some was very visible. The outcome was very visible. So this was a very important project that we were working on, and we had spent a fair amount of time with it. And then I got dragged to the user study. So the UX team had invited users in to test the software interface because it was now different than what they had been doing before. It specifically, we were building the tool for the homepage of the Economist website, for the
Okay.
Economist magazine, and it was a pretty big change. And I knew what the parts were of this display. And then, of course, we built all the stuff that was behind it. I could not understand what I was seeing. That users were just kind of all over the page and they moved, and I'm like, but it's right there. Like the button is right there. And realized we are not the users. Like if you're building software, you don't know anything about what it is for someone to come to the software fresh, where they don't know any of the things that you know. So we're the worst people to guess how users use it. And actually seeing and knowing and hearing is incredibly beneficial.
Hmm.
The second story was that years later, I had come back to do more work with them and was architecting basically a big systems change because the software is becoming obsolete and the world had changed. Had changed the way that print and digital and all the digital products flow together, right? It's what we call modernization.
Right, yeah.
And I was partnered with the head of graphics in trying to sort of figure out some elements of the system. And he said, I want you to watch the way the senior editors do their work in the current system. And I'm like, Bill, I don't have to do this. I understand how this software works. And no, I really want you to do it. First of all, there were 12 different systems because each of them had a completely different way of how they did their daily work. And they also had challenges I'd never considered before. If I hadn't done that, what I designed would be insufficient and in some cases ineffective because it was based on how I imagined the software to be used. So to prove your point that I really have experienced first my own resistance to what you're saying because I'm like, I know, I don't have to see this. And also the incredible impact and benefit of integrating how users experience the software and how we're building the software, that they are so interrelated and we really can't make that bridge unless we have some direct experience.
Yes. So is that how would you describe that? Is that tightening feedback loops? Is that are we to say that we need to do a better job of root analysis? What's the tool? What's the way of thinking there that we need to prioritize that we don't?
Synthesizing. That when we think about building and designing, architecting software systems, I think we really don't recognize the power of partnering with people who have a point of view or a skill set that is different than ours, right? That for me, for example, I think I speak business very well till I try and do it. And then someone who speaks business well is like, geek is crossing things off my page. Geek, oh my God, you can't help yourself. You're such a nerd. And the same thing with people who think about the user experience. And they often use very different language and they use different models in order to understand it. And so for me, when I can't possibly understand all the different perspectives. I don't necessarily need to, but I also can't, right? It's not within my skill set. And so what we're really doing is we're synthesizing knowledge and experience, our own and other people's. And then what the CEO is encouraging the team to do is that then they use sound judgment to decide how to best deliver what it is, deliver the impact that they're trying to deliver. But the synthesizing piece often gets left out, right? Which is that in order to really understand even a feature, we need to understand it from the user perspective, from the revenue, because we have mortgages. So we do want things to generate revenue usually.
Yeah.
And one person can't really do that. Can't, maybe in a small enough situation. And so where we say systems thinking, that relationships produce effect, it's relationships between people. Each person is a thinking system. And so if we're able to synthesize the knowledge and experience from these different perspectives into our workflow, into our process, into our decision-making process, then we get better, more holistic results. And now you're going to ask me, how is this ADRs? Is it and so collaborative modeling is certainly one of them. Things like event storming and just being together and opening a whiteboard instead of having a meeting where you're talking about linear, concrete priorities. Can you model? Can you model the impact? Can you model together what's going to happen and what people, when someone does something, what happens? Like what then happens? But also reconsidering the way that we're communicating through artifacts, whether it's writing or modeling or Slack channeling. Can we improve the way we're sharing this information so it's more synthesizable? Like, in other words, if the product people have decided this feature is really valuable, why? What convinced them? What are the reasons that convinced them that this was the most important thing to do? Making that visible to me as an engineer helps me to understand what they're trying to accomplish. So if the tech refuses because it's not able to do what they're imagining, I can make other recommendations because I understand what it is that we're trying to do better than if I'm just told the button should be red. Why?
So I've definitely witnessed people using like Jira not as a way of recording those things we want done and why, but as a way of not having to engage directly with other people.
Yeah.
Like we use systems of record to avoid personal interaction. Because if I write it down on the card, I won't get challenged on it.
Yes. So it's a really tricky thing, because what I want to say first is that there's a lot of noise. Like, people get very frustrated with, and as engineers, we have a lot of experience of people telling us to do things that aren't particularly wise to do or even possible. Nowadays, apparently, we can cure cancer with AI. Like anything, whatever your problem is, AI is the solution, right?
Yeah.
So the becoming kind of worn down from communication, I think I get that, right? I get to some extent why that can happen. Simultaneously, if our communication structure designs our system and we willfully don't have one, if every person is a silo, then that's what the software is going to look like too. Like, there are real repercussions to being unwilling to communicate is a form of communication.
Yes. Yeah. So it's not just Conway's law predicting that the structure of communication will dictate the structure of the system, but the quality of the communication too.
Yeah, and I would argue that using a JIRA ticket to create a human silo of a person who has no responsibility for maintaining the socio part of a socio-technical system is a systems design. That is a design. That is one way you can do it. You can have artifacts that isolate individuals and just have them do their thing. We suffer, I think, the delusion that that type of mechanistic and industrial control process makes a more productive team. This is not my experience.
This is something I was going to ask you, because I've always felt that there is this thread in the backbone of management sort of praying we can make a production line of software development.
Yes. Yes, it comes out of so most of the way that we work comes out of Taylorism, which is scientific management. So Taylor was an engineer and said that he was very frustrated with that he thought his team did like maybe 30% of the work they could possibly do, and that the foundational theory is that workers will do the minimal amount of work that goes unpunished. Basically, that workers are all employees, or they're all lying and trying to make it look like they're doing work when really they're not. They're not. And so we have a whole structure of power and control, like of how you, and it's very focused on the body as well. So Taylor said that if a manager tells you to sit, you sit. If it tells you to stand, you stand. So this is in our back to the office ideas, even though the studies are not suggesting that we're more productive if we're all in the office. Still, the majority of CEOs actually believe that that is the case, even if it's not actually a data-driven decision. And this came, so we've probably all seen Gantt charts. And yes. Henry Gantt's family was in the American South during the time of slavery. So they relied on slave labor. And when the Civil War ended, they lost that. So Henry Gantt went to Baltimore and studied with Taylor. And so the Gantt chart comes directly from how do we still have that kind of labor structure, but we have to pay. So they'd advocate for paying us by lines of code, for example, because lines of code show productivity. If you write more lines of code, you make more money, like piecemeal.
Yeah.
We're educated. Our education system is designed to feed this. And I don't want to overdo that, like sound paranoid. There's a giant conspiracy theory to make Taylorism. It's just, this is the system that we're used to. So we think that it's normal. And the challenge is we're knowledge workers. Like we are not building a single widget over and over again in a factory. We are sharing our knowledge and expertise and experience. We're learning, constantly learning and growing. We're making recommendations. We have to think well as an individual. We have to recognize our own logical fallacies and cognitive biases. And then we have to work well as a team. You know, you and I here today, people will only get value if you and I are doing well at knowledge sharing, right? We're knowledge sharing in order to knowledge share, right? Yep, and so the CEO in your story, in my experience, the challenge almost every organization makes is they try and keep this hierarchical, trickle down kind of linear coming out of Taylorism structure, and have systems thinking and learning and growing happen inside of that structure. So they keep, as soon as you said, well, the engineers are empowered, I'm making air quotes, to do their own thing, but there's product and business analysts, and like there's all these layers of hierarchy above them, then that's those two things don't fit very well together.
Yes. Yeah, I'd not thought of it that way. But yeah, the information flow is still very much hierarchical,
It
even
is.
if the
And
choice
that,
of how to execute is freeform.
exactly. And so when we're shifting to improve the kinds of things that you were describing, want to improve, we have to shift the way knowledge flows, and we have to shift the way people are partnering in order to think and solve challenges, and focus less on control and more on impact. How do I enable this cross-functional group of people to have impact on the system that pushes it in the right direction? That's the kind of leadership, that's systems, more of systems leadership, right? How do I create an ecosystem where knowledge sharing, where knowledge workers can thrive, and I can leverage their brilliance and their expertise and get more than I can if I try. I'm going to get more there in that way than if I industrialize and sort of and linearize and factorize the process.
So, as a CEO, what I'm looking for is, in order to do that, I am looking for the levers I can move.
Yes.
And in a lot of cases, I think it is. It's like, oh, I should have better procedures documents. I should come up with a procedure for this, a procedure for that. Seems to me what you're saying is I should start by considering information flows in the system.
Absolutely. That knowledge flow, Larry Pruzak says that organizations that don't recognize knowledge flow as the source of production will die, and they'll never know what killed them.
Knowledge flow as the source of production.
And I'm not sure now if source is the right word. I might be it might be force, not source, a force of production. But the point is, so everything I think is what I push to production. Everything we think together and talk about together, there's nothing in production that is not a result of our thinking and communication. Like, that's what we push to production. So if we want to push something different to production, we want to have asynchronous microservices instead of a CRUD software. First, I'm changing my own thinking. I've got ideas about what's the right thing and the wrong thing to do, and they are not going to apply. And the same thing then with the team and the teams and the way that information flows to make these decisions. It's going to also need to change. The iceberg, I think, that modernization and transformation initiatives hit is that we want something different in production, but we're not going to change the structure of our thinking and communication in order to get that. We're going to control it the way that we're used to controlling. And some of that is necessary. I've also worked in, we're a flat organization and and that was just giant cat farm. Like, there very little gets done. You do need workflows, and you do need constraints, and you do need some rules. Of any culture needs rules to get along well. Like, we have street lights when we drive, right? Yeah. I'm not saying everything's a free for all and it'll work out. But what you're describing in systems is called a leverage point, meaning, where can I intervene to make a relatively small change that will scale to have big impact, positive impact on the system? It's very hard to find leverage points. We're so distracted by our linearization of things. So what you're describing for the CEO is very much a systems approach, meaning, what's the actual blocker here? What is it that's keeping us from being as performant as I envision us to? What could I change? What could I make easier? What could I make easier? What could I change about our mental models, the rules and structures that govern the way that we work? What could I change that will actually move us in that direction? And that's often an experimental process because it's tricky to find those. It's much easier to just add more process.
Yeah. And I'm sure I've seen companies that change their messaging coming from the top a lot more often than they change the structure in which that message will flow through the system, right?
Yeah. Yes.
I'm just, if I can play devil's advocate for a second,
Please.
because it might be illuminating. I remember there was a reasonably famous memo from Jeff Bezos at Amazon that I could see as, we're all going to move to services-based architecture by the end of the year, or you're fired. Right. And in some tellings of that story, that's how AWS was born. Everything is going to be service-based first. And the difficult thing there is it sort of seemed to work. Like the big scary decree from on high did seem to change the way Amazon worked internally.
So I wonder, one of the things in these types of situations is, I think, is that why? Like, was that, we correlate the outcome as caused by the decree, but is that why they changed? I don't know. I know that.
Yeah, that's fair.
Right? Like maybe that would have happened anyway, or in many other kinds of ways. I actually don't know. I do know that personally, I only have swear words in my mind, so I won't say them to the audience.
This is a family show. Don't make me bleep it out.
It's like, but I don't feel like I don't feel like I do my best work when someone treats me that way. Like, you'll do what I say or you're fired. You do it. You do it. Like, this is not right. So I can't say that I think that way of communicating to adults is really a great and effective way. So I bristle a bit at that. But I do think, though, that or you're fired aside, constraints can be really energizing. Like, one of the things that people think that abstraction is a lot of faffing around and thinking about everything, but it's definitely not. It's about figuring out from this giant pile of ideas. In every organization, there are nearly infinite opinions about what we should do and how we should do it. And there's all kinds of ideas, and those ideas are uncoordinated, right? They might be good, but they're uncoordinated. The real science here is about being able to bring together the points of view and the ideas that actually are going to get us where we need to go. Like, using judgment to sort of figure out how you can synthesize some of these and ignore other things. What you ignore also designs a system, right?
Yes.
To know what to do. So constraints are a part of design. Every time you're choosing to use one tool instead of another tool because you've done some consideration and you think this tool is going to meet your need better, you're also architecting constraints into the system. Anything you might have gotten with the other tool, you won't have. So in this case of saying, there's a number of things that would do. In any organization, there are always competing priorities. In that case, you just got rid of anything else. Anybody comes up to your desk and says, this is what you should work on. We need a red button. Nope. Services. I'm only doing services, right? So you get rid of a bunch of the noise, and you're allowed to ignore a whole bunch of ideas. You also have the constraint of this is the highest priority. This architecture is the highest priority, and people feeling like motivated to collaborate, cooperate, figure out the problem.
Yeah, I can imagine some people under that decree feeling distinctly demotivated about the way they're being treated, but other people feeling very motivated in that here is a clear goal to run towards.
Yeah, and so I mean, I think you could potentially create that without the or you're fired thing. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I definitely don't think that you need to have a strong man approach to knowledge work. I don't, I don't, I don't think that. I, I think I think respecting the people's expertise who are choosing to help you make your organization successful. And you, what's the like you get more bees with honey kind of thing. I just
Yeah.
I don't. I'm definitely just not a fan of that. But that said, I do think that clarity of purpose, the ability for self-organizing to say, this is what we're going to do. We're going to go to the moon, or we're going to do this. And people can know to cross collaborate and solve problems in a particular way. Most organizations have so many things pulling, so many gravities pulling on people's priorities and attention that it can be hard to focus on any one thing for a period of time.
Yes, I would agree with all of that. And I don't take specifically that example of Jeff Bezos as being an example of what I think tech leadership should be, even if it happened to get the right result. It makes me wonder if what you think good management, particularly at the top, would look like.
I think for me, I think it's the same at the top as it is at the bottom. In that, um, in that, what you're paying for is minds, right? Is minds, is people's experience, their ability to think well, their ability to problem solve, share perspectives, their ability to learn, because whatever they're doing this year, they'll be doing something different likely next year.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, there's a, whether it's one team or a whole organization, that's where the richness and value is, right? Is in that people's willingness to share their knowledge and experience, their willingness to strive towards goals that are beyond their own personal goals, right? Trying to do something together. And so the better you are at developing an ecosystem that really brings out as much of that as possible, that encourages the type of emergent innovation that can only come from ideas coming in contact with other ideas, right? And growing and learning. Yeah. And that the way that I used to describe myself as a leader is that if the team is an apple orchard and there's no apples, I have no purpose. My purpose is apples. And so therefore, I'm concerned with the quality of the soil. I'm concerned with, do they need protection in the wintertime? I'm concerned with water and fertilizer. In other words, I'm developing an ecosystem where each of these apple trees are able to produce the very best and tastiest apples that they can produce. So I'm really developing an ecosystem where people's knowledge thrives. And so this idea that I'm in charge of the apples, I can yell at them and make them produce more or whatever. I mean, maybe apple trees like to be yelled at. I don't know. But I think that scales, right? It scales the same way, is that this ability to create ecosystems that leverage the power of the people who are there doing the knowledge work, enable them to work well together, enable them to thrive, then you get the most for your payroll dollars. Like, I wish it was just because I'm a nice person and I like being kind to people, which I do. But also from a business sense, I work with brilliant people who want to do hard things. So how do I help them succeed to do, and myself as well, how do we succeed doing hard things? Because I can't do it by myself. I need them.
The difficult thing is always, though, like with an apple orchard, I sort of know the inputs to generating good apples at the output. But with people, I could, in all the best faith, say we buy everyone the best laptops, and we don't use Jira, we use GitHub issues, and all these things. Sometimes it's very hard to know what nurturing that soil looks like.
So absolutely true. The one thing about the apple orchard, though, is that I think we know the inputs, but one of the things, there's a lot of overlap between the challenges in agriculture and the challenges in our industry. We take a very industrial, monolithic approach to agriculture as well. But in fact, we actually don't understand what makes good soil. It's so complex that we probably couldn't even necessarily computer analyze what's happening in soil. Soil is and it's always changing. And then there are pests, and then there are climate change. And then there are I kind of feel like there's nothing like an orchard to really show us how not in control of things that we think we are. But to your point, if you develop expertise in it, it's more straightforward than humans, right? Because the apple tree is not going to talk back to you, for example, or tell you vote. They don't vote, right? There's a whole thing there. Yeah. And so I want to acknowledge, right, that even now in the circumstance that I'm in, we're doing something novel, and there's 7 minds involved mostly. And it's very hard to synthesize 7 minds because we don't all want the same tools. We don't all process information the same way. So when you scale that up as an organization level, it is legitimately a challenge. There will be no one thing that works for everyone. I think it's a mistake to try and over standardize. But this is where what we call self-organizing. Self-organizing is a very high leverage point in systems. If a subsystem is able to effectively self-organize, that has more benefit than 5 nines, increasing storage, failover. That's a team being able to self-organize is going to have, in most systems, more impact than anything we could do with the tech.
I think I know what you mean by self-organized, but I actually think it's good if you give me your definition.
So meaning that they can proactively get the information and the insight and the understanding that they need and make good decisions about what they do in order to have a positive impact, that they don't need a lot of control, they don't need a lot of being managed, that they are actually able to get the job done. And if they don't know something, they'll find out, they'll ask.
But then does it become the job of the manager to ensure there are those lines of communication between their subsystem and customers, for instance?
Yeah. So if relationships produce effect, then the ability to remove blockers, to work with, because often we're still working in a hierarchical structure, right? So often, the team, if I'm working with a team, they'll want to make a recommendation, and I need to get money, right? For us to do, we want to do a thing and we need some money.
Yeah, give me the
So,
budget.
yeah, I might structure the way that I pitch our idea somewhat differently to business people or product people than I'd talk as an engineer. Like I might go outside the team to hunt and gather money and come back. Because I'm sort of an interface between these two subsystems, right? Between the subsystem that is accounting and the subsystem that is engineering. But I'm still speaking the truth as understood by the team, right? Like I'm not trying to control, or I'm not trying to make all the decisions. I'm just trying to improve the effectiveness of our ability to communicate our needs.
Yes, yeah, I totally see that. So there are two threads I need to pull on from that. I think I'm going to go with the language thread, because this reminds me of is it domain-driven design? Ubiquitous language. Yeah.
Yeah.
How important do you think that is? Do we all need to be speaking the same language across the board?
I don't think it has to be the same necessarily as it has to be understood, right? So, people, one of the things, so I talked about canonical data modeling once and the person I was training with had a very strong reaction because canonical data modeling in his experience is bad. What I realized is that in his experience, it was one data structure to rule them all, and all the subsystems had to use the same data structure. I'm like, oh, I don't mean that. I just mean some agreed upon ubiquitous data language. Like I don't mean it as so rigid. Recently, I was having a conversation with a team from a very big, well-known publishing company. And they were having the same problem I've had a number of times, which is if I were to get from the database, if I were to, or multiple databases, if I were to make a JSON structure that described, let's imagine a news article, like on the New York Times, there's a news article. One part, you have the little summary, right, that kind of tells you what the article is about.
Yeah.
There are 5 different names for that, right? Maybe it's an abstract, maybe it's a description, maybe it's a summary. The Economist editors called it a rubric, right? And so they were saying how many meetings they were having to figure out data structure that would be different in one database because it would be called summary in one and one in another, something else. So I use vocabulary like schema.org, for example, not necessarily designed for data structure, but it is describing the types of data or information or content, all the same to me, but we call it different things. When a machine reads the article, do they know what the title is? Do they know what the summary is? Does if it's feeding a large feeding a language model, or if it's Google is putting it into the information graph, so search results. And so developing ubiquitous language, in my experience, goes all the way down to data structure, goes all the way down to my team and I have worked very hard to make sure that our code and our functions use the language of the software, of the user, of the organization. Because I've had modules called by their vendor name, right? And it has a bunch of code in there. And then I don't know what it actually does. I just know that it's named after the vendor that interacts with it. My point being, ubiquitous language is really important for people. And that often when you're in a meeting and you're arguing, for example, bring up Agile. and watch the whole room explode because nobody means the same thing when they use that word. So when you're not understanding each other, it's often because you're using the same word to mean different things, or you're using two different words, but you mean the same thing. So a fundamental architecture practice is defining words, is making sure that the definitions of these words are clear. But my point is, it isn't just about getting along better with people. It'll end up in the code. It'll end up in the database. That making our software more human understandable, have more conceptual integrity, is also comes from our ability to create ubiquitous language, to be able to make software that mirrors the circumstances in which it exists, the experiences it serves.
Yeah, I can see that, as it will end up reflecting the natural conversations we have.
Yeah.
That takes me actually to the other thread I was going to pull on, which is very related, but sort of in the opposite direction, which is I've often wondered if the skills we develop as a software designer, like architecting this database talks to that REST interface, or these two actors in an actor model system talk to each other over this interface. I've wondered if getting good at designing those kinds of systems translates into also working with the soft systems, right? And when you say that a manager's job can be to be that interface between the communication of the software department and maybe the accounts department, that really makes me think, oh, there's a soft system that really looks like a hard system.
So what systems science would tell us is that there really isn't a difference. That they are so interwoven that we love to think that there's a big separation between hard and soft, between social and tech and all of this. But there's very little experientially that supports that. Like, and this is the challenge of concrete versus abstract, right? Like, but everything is everything is a concept. Even code is a concept, and having integrity in our ideas generates integrity in the code, and vice versa. The tech is also teaching us, because we have all kinds of things we'd love the tech to do, and it doesn't. It has constraints of its own as well, especially when they start being in relationship to each other. There's information missing, or it's not particularly well structured, or one service is slow because it has to munge a whole bunch of information to answer a simple question. Another one is fast because it just says yes or no, right? So the system itself has communication issues, and humans will have communication issues. And these issues are an endless cycle of feeding on each other. And so I do think that my experience has been that, for example, people who don't really care about the impact of communication on other people were more likely to say, well, we're just going to do a database query and then basically vomit that via JSON and on the API. Yes, but then we're not structuring the information for the consumers of that API. We're not using the language or the structure that they consume it in. We're using the structure that we save it into a relational database in. And they'll say, well, they can just use regular expressions. If you're forcing writing regular expressions on people, there is an empathy problem. Right? My son loves regular expressions and I don't. So this is an endless Thanksgiving family discussion.
Oh, that must be a great Thanksgiving table.
we are a very, very geeky family. Yes, there are so many of these I could point to. But the point being that structuring an API response for the consumer from the way the consumer is looking for information. So if we say a very simple decoupled front end React application and a back end where people are creating content, right? On the back end, the way that we think about the structure of that content, of that data, will be different than the front end who is serving the user and is meeting the needs of the user. And that ability to then have a good translation between the way the back end would provide information, the way the front end consumes it, without making the front end do all the work. That's how I translate using regular expressions, making the front end do all the work.
Yeah.
If there's a good relationship between the back end and the front end, if they're both doing work, if they understand the constraints and trade-offs, you have a better software system. But you only get that if you have a good people system that can work together to identify the design of that interaction.
Yeah. I think some people are going to listen to that and say, well, that's GraphQL, right? But it's not the technology. I think a technology like GraphQL comes out of a place where they're having more discussions about the way they will do communication between systems. And
also, if I mean, I can't speak for everyone, but my own experience is if you have a pile of swear word behind GraphQL, GraphQL will give you gray hair and make you run away screaming. Like my experience has been we work harder at the data structure when GraphQL is involved because it's even more important that the information is inherently interrelated. We can't just have a big giant pile of information. We need to understand in the storage, in the way we store it, how they're interrelated to each other. Like, if I use an article in the New York Times, the authors, the topics, the region, like there's a lot of things that are interrelated with the information in that article. GraphQL on the front enables a front end to get that article, but also everything by that author, also everything about that region. Also, everything about plane crashes, because that happened to be what it is. And in order for GraphQL to serve the front end, you actually have to be even smarter about your storage and your relationship, your data relationships, the structure of your data. GraphQL can't really sort through a giant pile of unless you have a graph design. GraphQL isn't going to design your data structure. That's not going to do that. It's not going to fix it for you.
Yeah, it's making me think if you opened a phone line that allowed people to ask for one specific shape of answer, you would organize your internal data in one way. If your phone line allowed anyone to phone up and ask arbitrary questions of you, you would get your information much more organized before you picked up the phone.
Right. And you'd have to make inference, right? So the one thing that these data systems, and I would argue AI as well, does not do very well is inference, meaning if one thing is so, what else might be so? Or how is this sentence meaningfully interrelated, meaningfully justified by or connected to or similar to all these other words, adverbs we put in between, to other types of information? That's something we actually have to design in order for it to follow those pathways. So for me, especially, I'm so glad we've ended up here, because this is absolutely the thing I focus on by far the most, right? Is that the way that we interrelate information is the only generator of potential knowledge and understanding, right? Information is just information without any meaningful interconnection, right, with other types of information. And if we're helping our system, our consumers of a GraphQL instance, for example, be able to get what they need, then we have to A, understand what they need, and B, understand in what context, because the consumers are in different contexts. They would get different things in different contexts. What context do they serve? And then also, how do we develop this interrelationship between information parts so that it generates meaningful responses as opposed to just, give me the article with this ID. That's pretty straightforward. We know how to do that.
Yeah. There is tremendous value in making connections between things, right? Often that's where the real value lies, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
And I guess that relates to the whole, are your developers talking to your user? Do you have a connection that relates this system piece of information person with that system information piece of person?
Yeah, and that increasingly, it isn't even just like there's the user, but also in a lot of cases there's multiple users with different agendas or different needs. So that gets it. That's more complex, and then also we're sharing information with other platforms, with other pieces of software. Increasingly, there's as much, if not more, communication within the software system as there is between the software system and the users. And so, this skill of designing relationships that take different points of view in mind, different contexts in mind, is increasingly essential for us to get really good results. And it's, I think, an architecture skill, a systems leadership skill, is that these relationships are changing. The patterns that govern them are changing. We are increasingly asked to serve multiple contexts. So, for example, what we know is that this was a while ago, so it may have changed, but I got this lovely little factoid in my head, and I've kept it there because it's illustrative. That if you have a restaurant website, when people go to your website on a desktop, they're usually looking for your menu, and when they go to it on their phone, they're looking for your address. And so, if in context, right, like if you ask a question to Alexa is getting information that wasn't published as an answer in Alexa. It was usually published as part of a Wikipedia page or an article or a website or some sort of digital publication. And Alexa has extracted that little piece out of the bigger context. So increasingly, that the linear connection between a software and a person, and the person's using the software and the software is doing things for the person, even that is getting more complex.
Yeah. Then I think the next thing I have to ask you is, because I can see all that. I can see the connection between systems having value and the context in which they exist having value. I definitely can see a blurring between whether we're talking about people or software or a mixture of both. And I'm starting to feel slightly overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Because the number of potential contexts and interconnections are almost infinite. And in a tiny company of 3 people, you're allowed that number of infinite connections. My question to you is, how do you prune down to the ones that matter?
Yeah, and that is the question. Like, if you say what so someone quoted me once. I had 2 different slides, and they put the slides together to say, so what Diana's saying is that wisdom is knowing what it depends on. And I'm like, I didn't say that, but I'm gonna say it now because that is great. Like I didn't put the two pieces together, right? So when we say, the answer in architecture is it depends, right? Because it does, right? It does depend. You can't just do what Netflix does. You have to actually understand the forces acting on your system, right? Donella Meadows says, I can work on a system. I go into a new system. I have to spend time with it. I can't just come in and say, do this. You don't know, right?
Yeah.
So, so the recognition of this increasing relational complexity and this potential for nearly infinite consumers. If you put up an API, like the whole world can come and they'll all have different needs and all of that is really important. But figuring out in any particular situation, there aren't nearly infinite possibilities. In any particular situation, it's much like deciding with your family where to go on vacation. You can go anywhere. Let's say you have $10,000, which means you could pretty much go anywhere. But you have natural constraints, right? Maybe nobody's interested in skiing or winter sports, so that rules out half the planet in the wintertime. Maybe some members of the family are very young, and so that limits. You just have preferences. So in any particular situation, understanding systems as a whole is what we're saying, meaning there's always change, there's always uncertainty. It's basically deciding uncertainty is welcome and invited and natural and unchangeable. But inside of our particular circumstances, there are the goal of the system is going to prioritize certain things over others. For example, FedEx's advantage is it delivers packages quickly. So in that system, if people were talking about performance and speed and optimization, yes. Right? Yes, because that system depends on fast data, really, really fast data. If you were focused on making a really exquisitely fancy front end, maybe not so much, because it would be lovely to go to FedEx.com and have a really pretty user interface. But that really is not the highest priority in that system. And it's the same in our particular circumstances, just being aware of the fact that nothing is linear and that it's not as siloed and simple as we think it is, and being curious about that and proactively considering other points of view, that's in most cases, that's sufficient. Even just trying to understand the point, like watching the user use the front end and realizing you don't know anything about user behavior, that is usually sufficient. And when you get to know a system and the value it provides, there are naturally going to be things that matter more than other things. And the challenge is usually all of the noise, all of the ideas that are about how things should be done that are not actually very strongly connected to having a positive impact on the system. It's usually all the uncoordinated ideas, more so than the one or two. So it's summarizing that very long-winded way of saying it, but it's the question I get asked all the time, is that when we get to the point of it's very overwhelming, then we've probably talked enough about the potential, right? What systems thinking means and all of the things we could probably think about. And instead, then the point really comes to, how can I personally have impact today? What can I do today? How can I change either the way I'm communicating or something in the system that really actually will improve the value of this system overall, improve the experience for users, improve its ability to exist and help me pay my mortgage. And that's not easy. It's actually very hard, but it's not as hard as sorting out all of the 70,000 million ideas about what we should do in order to have impact. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It leaves me wondering how we can be sure that we connect ourselves to that value.
Yeah, and also too, how can we live with not being sure? So we want to, and I think it's very straightforward in that if teams can articulate how they're having impact on that value, it's a sign of a good, healthy knowledge flow in an organization. I have worked with organizations where we tried to figure out what the core domain was, like FedEx, fast package delivery, and discover the reasons the teams are having such a hard time is if you put 8 VP or higher whatever people in the room, they all have different ideas about what the core value is of the system. And therefore, how the heck would the teams actually know how to prioritize? So if it can be connected, that is a sign that people really do understand what they're trying to do with this software system. And if you can't do it, then that triggers, I think, the need to keep asking these questions and challenging how these are coming together. So the right question is often more valuable than the right answer, right? That we can ask questions to get more information.
Do you think it's also the case that some kind of feedback and some kind of communication line is more valuable than just trying to get the right one?
I don't know if we can know when you're making a systems change, and I say this different. If you know what to do, then just do it. You don't need systems thinking. Like, you don't have to overanalyze every but will this, but Diana said we should think about multiple contexts and all the different. No, Diana said that's systems thinking, not that you should do it for every action. That's just causes paralysis. If you know what to do, just do it. If you're wrong, fix it. That's cool. We use systems thinking when there isn't a right answer, when there are multiple ways. When I teach workshops, I put people in a situation where there is no one right answer and help develop over the day the way of still creating a path to action. And so I think trying to be right will be crazy making, because you're right, but also the other team has a different solution and they're also right. Both of these ideas could potentially have benefit. And so I think focusing on understanding the circumstances, understanding how did you reach this conclusion? ADRs are a great a tool for that, right? Not if you just say, architecture decision record.
Oh, okay.
So people use them to say, we decided on Kafka. That's not what I mean. I mean, we considered this solution on that solution. We prioritize these reasons. We didn't, this other tool had things we don't want. Show your thinking. Basically, like a math test, you're supposed to show your work so that you can see where you might have made a mistake. Same for us. Show our work. How did we reach the conclusion? And then so other people can understand how we came to that conclusion. And then how will we know if we had impact? How will we measure it? So I really think that giving up the idea that in these types of situations there is a right way and a wrong way is dualistic thinking, is a linear thinking feature. Right, wrong, yes, no, good, bad. In systems, it depends. Sometimes a thing that's good in one system is bad in another, and vice versa. We get to figure out what it depends on. In this system, what's the value that we can contribute? So I've overwhelmed with all the ways that you get there, but we are doing it already most of the time. Like we when you get to know a software system or a people system, most of the time, if you go in and ask people where the pain point is, they know what the bottleneck. They just don't know what to do about it. So that's at least we know where to focus, even if we don't yet know how to improve it.
Yeah. Okay, so one last question. I was thinking about this morning, and it's a fun question, but it may be a hard one. I don't know. I'm going to ask you and see what you say.
Okay.
But I was thinking about how we play match 2 games with kids. Like you deal out cards, and they have to find 2 sevens, and they get a point, right?
Yes.
You know, and it's a game we play to train children's memories. And then I was thinking about chess, and it's a game that's fun, but it's also about training people to think strategically.
Mm-hmm.
So the question I have for you, is there any place in this world of ours we can train to think in terms of systems? Or is that software design?
Well, software, I mean, information systems for sure. Like when I lucked into the work that I'm doing is very much, but so there's one that comes right to mind, and I use it in talks. But the reason I hesitate just is accessibility, and it doesn't help us so much with software. So it's not a perfect answer, but I'm going to give it anyway. It's the beer game. So the beer game. So Jay Forrester developed this a long time ago. The person who gave us the understanding of counterintuitiveness. So the word counterintuitiveness comes from Jay Forrester.
Okay.
And so in the game, and if I understand correctly, I think MBAs at MIT, because he was out of MIT, they still play the beer game when as part of their education. I don't know for sure if that's the case, but so basically there's a number of different ways to play it, but the way I describe it is that you have a group of people, you split them into 3 teams. One team is the retailer. So they have a really cool craft beer and kombucha store in Austin, Texas, that used to be a gas station, and now it's a craft beer and kombucha store. And on the other side, you have a brewery that are developing really interesting new beers. Now, when I've told the story in front of tech groups, especially in Germany, I've come up with an example of a beer, like a cranberry beer. And then people come right up to me afterwards and tell me how horrible that, like, I clearly don't know beer. This is a horrible example. And I'm sure they're right. I do not care for beer myself. So very hoppy is the feedback I've gotten. Like extra hoppy beer is the right example.
Okay.
So they developed this especially hoppy beer. In the middle is the distributor. So they, that's kind of boring, administrative, but they make the most money. And they're the people that get beer from the breweries and deliver it to the retailers. Very straightforward information flow. Retailer fills out a form for the distributor. Distributor puts all those numbers together and orders from the brewery with a form. Like it's just a form to a form.
Right.
So the game begins because this is getting outdated now, but like Taylor Swift is drinking that beer at the Super Bowl or anywhere on the planet, walking down the street. Taylor Swift is drinking the beer. So suddenly demand increases because a whole bunch of people, they even drive from Dallas to go to Austin, to go to the gas station, kombucha and craft beer store to get the beer, right? And then the game goes from there, where if you play it in person, you move little blocks to order, like resources game, board game. So there are just round after round of ordering and making decisions about what to order. And inevitably, it's a giant mess. It's a giant chaos mess. Everybody loses, basically. In the beer game, you end up with just a whole bunch of beer that's never going to get drunk in a warehouse, and everybody's mad at each other. The thing that we learn from this game is knowledge flow, because you could do very well at the beer game if you made a Google spreadsheet that showed time delays and orders. And if you made the information transparent across the system, people would have a better time playing the game. But very few people think of doing that. Mm-hmm. Instead, the game ends and it's a mess. And you ask, what went wrong? And this is one of the ways we learn that we blame, and we blame the wrong thing. What went wrong? And the craft beer store blames the distributor, and the distributor blames the poor brewers, and the brewers blame the supply chain, and all of it was information flow, but they're very convinced about they were getting screwed by the other teams. And they don't realize the reason it happened is they start over ordering. They think they're not getting what they need. They think they're not being heard. So they start over ordering. And then now the information flow is becoming antagonistic between the teams, as opposed to what they actually need. And so you have that experience and go, I live this every day. I live the beer game in every meeting I ever go in, right? We're constantly playing the beer game. Always, 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 always. So having that experience and then applying it to your life begins to show how much drama comes out of what is simply the flow of knowledge and information and proactive cross-functional working, the lack of cross-functional thinking. Yeah.
Oh, I'm glad I asked that question. I'm going to see if we can set up a game of that at my next games night.
Yeah, so there's software you can do it, but so far I found it very expensive to do. So I've not been able to facilitate it in a room of people, but I very much would like to develop one that's more relevant to us, right? That is more software related. So I sort of have this in the back of my mind at some point to try. We'll see.
You'll move from being an architect to an author to a games designer.
Which all three of those things, I feel like they overlap an awful lot. Like, anyway, I feel like sometimes I am designing games, even though they're not as much fun as.
Yeah. I think on that note, I'll have to let you get back to designing the next game and hoping it plays out well. Diana, thank you very much for that.
Yes, I'm so happy that we got to do this more. I love the questions that you ask. I feel like we could do that all day.
Yeah, we'll save that for the for next year's episode. When your game comes out, I'll invite you back.
Then we'll do a marathon game. Yes,
live playthrough. Yeah. We'll
okay. Now I have a deadline. See, your constraints are good.
Diana, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Diana Montalion. And I have to tell you a quick story about her name before we go. So I always ask my guests the correct pronunciation of their name, because sometimes it's obvious, but often not so much. And I'd not seen Diana's surname before. So when we first met, I said, is it French? Is it something like Montalion? And she said, yes, pronounce it that way, please. And she wouldn't tell me the way that she normally pronounces it after that. So If you know Diana and you're wondering why I'm saying it the way I'm doing it, that's why. I'm under orders from her to say it in my kind of mangled high school British French accent. So there we go. If you want to hear more from Diana, regardless of how you pronounce her surname, she has an O'Reilly book called Learning Systems Thinking, link in the show notes. I've been greatly enjoying my copy, kind of hoping that 2025 is going to bring me some opportunities to put the knowledge into practice. But we'll see. We'll see what the year ahead brings. In the meantime, if you've enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to like it, rate it, share it with a friend, share it on a social network. We are on Patreon and YouTube memberships if you want to support more episodes of Developer Voices in the coming year. But for now, I think it's time to get on with that year. It's time to go. I've been your host, Chris Jenkins. This has been Developer Voices with Diana Montalion. Thanks for listening.